Hey folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Returning to the podcast today is Dr. Ian Isherwood, here to discuss his recently released book titled The Battalion: Citizen Soldiers at War on the Western Front. A bit of Dr. Isherwood's own history. Ian Isherwood is Associate Professor of War and Memory Studies at Gettysburg College in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department and an affiliate in the History Department. Most of his scholarly work considers the experience of war and representation in the era of the two world wars. Having taught at a college on a famous battlefield for the past 13 years, Isherwood is also interested in the American Civil War and the connections between that conflict and broader concepts of historical memory in America. Isherwood is the author of Remembering the Great War, co-editor of Serpents of War, an American officer's story of World War I combat and captivity, and The Battalion: Citizen Soldiers at War on the Western Front. He has also written numerous journal articles and reviews. He is currently working on a book concerning the politics of commemoration from the Civil War to the Global War on Terror, tentatively titled Remembering America's Wars. Isherwood is a graduate of Gettysburg College, Dartmouth College, and the University of Glasgow, the latter where he did his PhD in history at the Scottish Centre for War Studies. He is a fellow of the International Society for First World War Studies, a member of the Society for Military History, and is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. During the academic year 2022 to 2023, Isherwood was honored to serve as the Harold K. Johnson Chair of Military History at the United States Army War College. In 2023, he was a summer fellow in residence at the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. And now, onto the book, from Casemate Publishers. How did ordinary citizens become soldiers during the First World War? And how did they cope with the extraordinary challenges they confronted on the Western Front? These are questions Ian Isherwood seeks to answer in this absorbing and deeply researched study of the actions and experiences of an infantry battalion throughout the conflict. His work gives us a vivid impression of the reality of war for these volunteers and an insight into the motivation that kept them fighting. The narrative traces the history of the 8th Battalion, the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, a Kitchener battalion raised in 1914. The letters, memoirs, and diaries of the men of the battalion, in particular, the correspondence of their commanding officer, reveal in fascinating detail what wartime life was like for this group of men. It includes vivid accounts of the major battles in which they were involved: Loos, the Somme, Passchendaele, the German Spring Offensive, and the final 100 Days campaign. The battalion took heavy losses, yet those who survived continued to fight and took great pride in their service, an attitude that is at odds with much of the popular perception of the Great War. Ian Isherwood brings in the latest research on military thinking and learning, on emotional resilience and cultural history to tell their story. Folks, I hope you enjoy the discussion. Also, I do hope you go out and get a copy of The Battalion. You will not be disappointed. Links to that are in the episode notes, as well as a link to the HJC Peers website, where you can learn a little bit more about the members of the 8th Queens. Dr. Isherwood, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking time to come on this evening.
Oh, I'm so happy to be on again. It's great being here, and thanks for doing this podcast. It's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just dive right into the questions here. In the Serpents of War episode with Dr. Stephen Trout, we discussed your pathway into history and Great War history. This time we'll focus our inquiry a bit more narrowly. What interested you an American in diving into the history of one of Kitchener's battalions in the British Army in World War One?
It's a very good question. So when I went to graduate school, when I did my PhD, I realized I wanted to work on the British experience of war as it had come down to us through memoirs, through soldier memoirs, and through war books, and dating from the war itself all the way through the Second World War. And so I immersed myself as a PhD student in kind of that literature, and there are hundreds of these memoirs that came out. And so I my first book was on British memoirs, and it in many ways was kind of pushing back against Paul Fussell's book, The Great War in Modern Memory, where I was trying to show that the British experience of war, as it was written, was much more varied than we typically understand it. And so out of that book came really me diving a bit more deeply into what the British experience of war was, and what got me into kind of British history, or got me into kind of studying at Kitchener Battalion. If you'll labor me telling a long-winded story, if you don't mind.
I love long-winded stories.
So as I was writing my first book, a student of mine, whose name was Marco Dracopoli, I was teaching History 110, 20th Century World History, and Marco came up to me after class and said, I have my great-grandfather's World War I letters. And this happens occasionally. People know you're interested in World War I. They'll come up to you. They'll say, I have somebody's letters. And you think it's a letter or two or 10 letters or something like that. I'm not dismissing that, but I'm just saying that, like, it's usually not that substantive of a collection of works. So he brought in the box and showed me the box, and he said, yeah, my great-grandfather was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He commanded a battalion. He won the DSO 3 times. And here are 300 letters he wrote home to his family, plus trench maps, plus photographs, plus medals, plus ephemera, all of that stuff. And so I had a look at the materials. I realized that, just as Marco realized, that it's a real treasure trove. And the family donated them to Gettysburg College with the understanding that we would make a digital history project releasing the letters 100 years to the day in which this officer wrote them. So we created the project, www.jackpiers.org, as a centenary project of the First World War. And based out of that project, we, did a ton of extra research. We took student researchers to France and to Belgium. We created new mapping kind of technology in which we were showing that, like, the Western Front as a space is a much more varied and much more mobile space, than we think it is. And so we really did a lot with that project. But what was really needling me the whole time was the idea that maybe this could become a book. And so I started going to the National Archives in the UK and going through kind of the experience of the 8th Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment, and really realizing that Piers's story is one part of this, his journey is one part of it, but then the other part of the story is what's going on around him. And so as I started researching more and more, I kind of had to learn how to become a better military historian over the last 6 or 7 years. And I'm a little embarrassed to say the book took me that long, but it certainly did, because as you probably realized when you're reading it, I put a lot of painstaking research into making sure I got the story right. And as I kept doing it, it was really important to me, in particular as family members of the 8th Queen started reaching out to our project, and to me, it's really important for me to get as much of the story right as a historian can, knowing that we can't get it entirely right, but knowing that I can get as close to it as I can with the sources I have.
That's fantastic. I have my next question here. So it was to tell us a little bit about Hugh John Chevalier Piers and the formation of the 8th Battalion, the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. And I have to feign ignorance, but I think it's kind of okay because I do have a map behind. Nope, over there. Where is where is Surrey in England? I apologize. Just off the top of my head, I don't quite
So
recall.
it's just right south of London. So the
Okay.
county's right south of London, and there's West Surrey and there's East Surrey. And the West Surrey Regiment is the Queen's Royal West Surreys, and it's an old historic regiment. It's the second regiment of line in the British Army, and so it's got an old esteemed history behind it. Who is Hugh John Chevalier Pierce? That's a question I've been kind of wrestling with for 10 years or so. More than that, actually. So Piers was born into in England what they would call kind of an upper middle class family, which means his family was pretty well off. His father was a solicitor, so he was a lawyer, and Piers went to private school. He went to a school called Charterhouse, which is the same school that the war poet Robert Graves went to. They weren't contemporaries, but they went to the same school. He went to Charterhouse and he went to Oxford, where he studied the law. But really, he mostly played soccer or football when he was at Oxford. That's what he was really into. And then he got out with a law degree. He joined the local militia of the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment. So kind of being like a weekend warrior type of soldier while training in the law. And then he resigned his commission right before the First World War so he could focus on the law in his father's firm in London. They had a really attractive address in St. James in London. It's like this really kind of ritzy area. And so he went into the law. And then when the war broke out in 1914, he volunteered to go back to his old regiment, initially as a lieutenant or lieutenant, and then he rises through the ranks over the course of the war to become the battalion commander of the 8th Queens. So he's in the same unit, this 8th Service Battalion of the Queens throughout the entire war. He miraculously survives the war. He's wounded 3 times, and he's in every major engagement in which they're fighting in. He's also an exceptionally brave officer. He earns the Distinguished Service Order, which is a medal for gallantry. He earns that 3 times over the course of the war, and he really distinguishes himself. That being said, he's like your typical citizen soldier. So he has a civilian mindset throughout the war, and this comes across in his letters when he's writing home. He complains about staff officers. He complains about like professional military officers. He's always asking his family to send him creature comforts from home. Like he's very much a civilian who happens to be in uniform. And over the course of the war, he really, really distinguishes himself and is a core part of why this unit kind of holds itself together over the course of the war. The 8th Queens are made up of a wide gamut of kind of citizens who join up. It's a volunteer unit, so everybody who's in it at the beginning of the war volunteers to serve. They have no rifles. They have no uniforms when they first volunteer in September 1914. It's kind of a hodgepodge group of civilians. There's people in the middle class. There's people in the working class. So there's gamekeepers and clerks who are all serving with one another. Their officers are pretty well off for the most part. So they're all what we'd consider upper middle class Britons with private educations. But over the course of the war, that changes, and their officers become more democratic. They're more kind of lower middle class people that become officers, working class officers, etc. So what I was kind of trying to do is show in a microcosm that the experience of this one unit in the First World War really shows us something interesting about the British experience of war.
Yeah, I thought that reading through it, like your book is much more than just your average military history, and I really appreciate how you provide that whole story, like talking about like where a lot of the men come from, and also like that as like the war goes on, the change the battalion goes through, that we'll talk about in a bit here, but also like those officers rising through the ranks, and it has me thinking now like, oh yeah, like that would have had a big effect on leadership, how things are carried out, like even like things like discipline and the way battle is carried out and everything under these officers. Speaking of battle, the Eighth Queens, as you said, like they're stood up around the September 1914 timeframe. They spend about a year training and then head over to the front. And they are introduced to battle at the Battle of Loos in September of 1915. So the war has been going on for 14, 15 months at this point. How was the introduction of the Eighth Queens to the battle at Loos, and how prepared were they?
So this is an interesting question, and it's one of the aspects of the book that I spend a lot of time trying to figure out within the existing primary sources, what the real story was. So the Eighth Queens are part of a division called the 24th Division, and they're in the 72nd Brigade of the 24th Division. The 24th Division is what's called the General Reserve, and they're marched up to the front line at Loos after only being in country in France for 20 days or so before they start the march up to Loos. Now, the key aspect to understand is that they've been training in England, but they hadn't done any real training at the divisional level of any substance. So they'd done a lot of training in marching and marksmanship and small unit tactics and things like that. But when they get to France, it becomes very apparent that they're pretty undertrained for kind of large unit or divisional style attacks. That being said, the march up to the Battle of Loos is absolutely exhausting for them. Not because they're not physically fit, they very much are so, but because the roads leading up to the battle are deeply congested. And so they spend a lot of time trying to get up into battle. And then when they do, they're basically walking into battle at Loos. They walk into battle having basically 2 sleepless nights, having no water in their canteens or anything like that. They're ordered to go into a frontal assault against the German second line on the 26th of September, 1915. They have no artillery support, and they end up suffering pretty catastrophic losses. They lose half their officers and just kind of over half their men. So it is a horrific day for them, and it's a terrible bloodletting. But it's one that these officers, the ones who survive, are going to remember for the rest of their lives. What's really kind of tragic to the story is that there's a report done by the British Army afterward that blames the division for kind of poor march discipline for going up the line. So it says basically these guys are undertrained, they're underprepared, and it's their fault. But if you look closely at the sources and you examine what they were asked to actually do, I'm very skeptical as to whether any unit could have met those objectives. So it's a horrific bloodletting for them in their first day, but it's something that they have something of a chip on their shoulder afterward about it, where for some of these officers, they want to make sure this is not going to happen again.
Wow, the parallels between the BEF in September of 1915 and the AEF 3 years later in the Meuse-Argonne offensive are oh my God, it's the same thing. Like the
79th, absolutely.
Yeah. The 79th Division, the American 79th, they after taking Montfaucon, another raw division, they get the blame for holding up the advance. You know?
That's right. And there's something about my research where I'm drawn to these kind of units, I think, because Serpents of War was all about that too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Just like, oh my God, guys, come on now. So Loos is obviously, as you said, it's a catastrophic experience. And that's their brutal introduction into the West Front. And so after the Battle of Loos, life goes on, the war goes on, and the Eighth Queens, they rotate through the line. How did they harden themselves to the realities of war on the Western Front?
Yeah, so for the survivors of Loos, so the men who survive are then joined by a bunch of replacements. So there's hundreds of men that come in, they rotate back in. And so the survivors then are sent up to Ypres, and they go into trench rotation at Ypres. And it's really through that kind of the day to day rotating up and down the line. I mean, they're suffering casualties throughout the entire time, but they're kind of low level casualties. It's like a low level conflict, and they're really adjusting both physically and mentally to the space that is the Western Front. And it's pretty miserable service. I mean, it's wet, it's wintertime. It's still brutal, but they're not called in to go into any real attacks. So they're kind of physically and mentally adjusting to what the landscape of the Western Front actually is. And their officers, when they're not actually in the trenches, they're coming out of the line and they're training. And that's a key component to this whole story, that I'm trying to show with the book, is that they're spending basically a fourth of their time, maybe even less than that, actually in the front lines or in support lines. They're spending a lot of time behind the lines training. They're spending time resting. They're spending time on fatigue duties. They are, the trench rotation they go into in late 1915, early 1916 really serves them relatively well.
Awesome. And it's not, and another thing that I liked about is that your book is that despite the misery of being on frontline duty in the trenches, like you also point out that in the rear, like officers, even the men, they found joy in the small things and found joy in happiness, like pretty much wherever they could.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the funny things when you're going through like the brigade war diaries, is that when they're out of the line, they're arranging sports competitions. There's boxing matches, there's soccer competitions, there's foot races, there's mule races, like there's cinemas, there's all kinds of activities for these men, and of course they're going out and they're drinking, they're looking for women, they're doing all things that kind of soldiers do in that war, and soldiers do now. And so they're certainly living outside of the front, and trying to make the best of a bad lot.
Yeah. So going again, like with your book, a feature that I really appreciated and like really felt deeply about is that you go beyond just talking about the battles, just talking about the losses and officers and men killed and wounded and the numbers. You take the time to give us some background of some of the battalions fallen. And would you tell us about like maybe just one or two of them here?
Yeah, sure. So they're kind of a number of men in which I think I tried to focus on a bit and try to understand what their experiences were like. I have a whole chapter in the middle of the book called "Life and Death," in which I'm going through a number of these figures, and I'm putting their lives in kind of context. And one of the people who in that chapter is very important is a soldier named D.O. Lee. And D.O. Lee, who went by Dave Lee, he was a common soldier. He left behind a sketchbook in the Imperial War Museum. And we don't know a ton about him, but what we know from his sketchbook is that he was a kind of a talented illustrator. He drew these wonderful pictures that he was mostly tracing from magazines in which he was watching, or sketching from magazines in which he was reading. But he also recorded in it a bunch of, he recorded anecdotes about going out and drinking with his friends. He recorded in it, professional things like how to use a Lewis gun and how to throw a bomb and those kind of things. But he also had photographs of his sweetheart that he had glued on the inside of it so he could see her. And her name was Daisy, and she probably gave him the notebook in which she was sketching in. And D.O. Lee sketched his notebook in 1916 during the Somme and in early 1917. And sadly, he was killed at Passchendaele. And then his notebook ended up back in the Imperial War Museum so that I could see it and look through it and to kind of speculate about what his life was like. Another soldier, an officer by the name of Claude Woolat, has stuck with me as well. Claude Woolat was a captain in the Queens. He served at the Battle of the Somme, and right before the Queens went into battle in August of the Battle of the Somme, Claude Woolett's brother was killed just the month beforehand. His brother was a lieutenant in the 7th Queens, and he was killed in Trones Wood. And when you look at a map and you see where the Queens were fighting, the two brothers were fighting less than a mile away from one another. And Claude Woolett ended up being killed in the Queens' attack outside of Guillemont. And when you go and you visit Thiepval Memorial, both the Woolett brothers are memorialized next to each other under the Queen's placard. So when you see it and you understand the story, it's incredibly moving, really. And one of the things that I think, one of the difficulties for historians is that you uncover all of these stories, and it's very difficult not to be personally affected and drawn into their lives, And I went through dozens of officer service records and also enlisted men service records, those that have survived. And like when you go through them, you see men who, they commit infractions. Some are court-martialed. Some go to hospital. Some die in hospital. Some make it back from hospital and are wounded and killed. Some are shell-shocked. And we have records of their infirmary. And when you're going through that, it's a very humbling experience, because you realize that you're not just writing a history of the battalion moving here and there, but you're instead writing a history of men's lives in war and how war affected their lives. And so it was very important for me to actually bring that part of the story into it. And I'm really glad that you recognize that about the book. So that was one thing that I was very conscious of trying to preserve.
Yeah, I just felt you feel this connection to the guys, and as you're reading the book, like you feel like you can really see their development as a unit, and I don't know, like you get attached to them, it's really well done.
Thank you.
So that development of the 8th, what's the difference between the Battle of Loos and the Battle of Third Ypres for the men of the 8th Queens?
Yeah, so this is big. I mean, so Loos is September of 1915. They're in the Queens are in the first assault of the Battle of 30 and on the 31st of July, 1917. So they have 2 years of experience. Now, it's not exactly the same battalion that was fighting, because they've suffered so many casualties. The good thing is that their senior leadership remains relatively the same. So they have some captains. Piers is in the battalion. They have a very good lieutenant colonel that joins them right after. His name's Tringham, joins them right after Loos. So they have a good command structure to be able to train the younger officers and to be able to train the men. The difference is that the war has evolved so much by 1917 that it's almost unthinkable for the British Army to send an open order attack in the same way that they did in 1915 by 1917. So the plan for the 8th Queens' attack at Third Ypres is a plan that is the most sophisticated set-piece battle that they're going to fight in the entire war. There's a creeping barrage that's meant to advance in front of them. There is they're using flares to mark their exact placement as they're moving along, that are then being spotted by airplanes above them, right? They're carrying into battle carrier pigeons. They're carrying extra barbed wires so they can reinforce their flanks. They have Lewis guns. They have rifle grenades. They have bombers. They have men trained in small platoon assault tactics, which they don't have in 1915. Yeah, it is a super sophisticated engagement. And they're able to take all 3 of their objectives that day. So they're able to, with this kind of set-piece, creeping barrage approach, they're able to meet their objectives. The downside is that as they're doing it, they still suffer pretty terrible casualties. And because that's kind of the nature of the Western Front. So especially by this point of the war. So Piers feels very proud of his battalion. He's very happy about what they've accomplished. At the same time, they're men who are literally drowning in shell holes as medics are trying to get to them and trying to help them. So all their attacks are kind of a mixed bag, but this is a successful attack, but comes at a very costly price.
Wow. Gosh, man, it's that Third Ypres, finally just spent 10 days there last summer in the Ypres
Oh,
area.
really?
Yeah, and one thing I was blown away is how small it is. Like you have this idea of the mighty Ypres salient, but it's all rather close together. And just to think of like um, a good friend of mine pointed out, like right here, like the British were under German observation, and over there as well, and over here as well. It's like, oh my God, like so much happened in this small area, and at almost like any point within the salient, you can turn in some direction and see the Ypres spires, and it's like, oh wow, it's also very close, but so like it makes me understand
Yeah.
what
Yeah,
Ypres
definitely.
to the British people. So, and then to see like these guys are going into battle, they're way better trained, they're way better experienced, but yet still taking these heavy casualties because it's the nature of the Western Front.
Yeah, and there's no way to prevent them because they're under artillery fire from the beginning of their attack. They don't have, I would consider, heavy resistance at each one of their positions, but it's the bombardment really that is causing so many casualties. So they're out in the open and they're just under artillery fire, um, and 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 it's one of these things too that whenever you read war diaries, you recognize that like it's always the unit on the left or the right that's struggling for the successful unit. So you advance to a certain point, and then you realize we're exposed on three sides because the units on either side of us haven't met their objectives, and because it's harder for them to meet their objectives, and so that's just a part of the nature of how they're fighting.
With those losses, how different is the battalion, from the time it deployed in 1914 to, the battles that it faced throughout 1918? It's obviously much better trained. There's a lot of turnover in the membership, of course, like in the enlisted ranks and in the officers. So how was it a completely different unit? I know Lieutenant Colonel Piers is still a member, but like how much has it changed by 1918?
So by the end of the war, there's only three of the original 20 existing officers left. And the enlisted men's a bit difficult to track because the records are not really that great. But we can assume that it's a pretty significant turnover. And one of the things that Piers comments upon is that the unit in 1918 is an incredibly young unit because they're bringing in men who are 18 and 19 years old or who are lying about their age, but they are very, very young men. And the officers in particular, he thinks, are exceptionally young. But I'm a college professor, so it's one of these things where every year I look at new first year students and I'm like, they keep getting younger every year. So maybe Piers was channeling something of that, uh, but certainly it is a much younger unit by 1918. That being said, I think a lot of the old salts from 1917 are still there when they're fighting during the Kaiserschlacht in 1918, which is kind of their big moment as a battalion. And so I think that, and I know for a fact that a lot of the veteran officers are still with the battalion in early 1918. The Kaiserschlacht, that was very bloody, so they end up, it ends up shifting a bit, and the battalion gets younger after that.
Yeah, and your telling of that story at the village of Le Vergier was a riveting chapter, and for all the folks listening, like that's definitely, oh my God, that's great reading right there.
Thank you. So that chapter took me forever, by the way.
Well, it was worth it. It paid off.
Thank you.
So final question of the evening is, how are you keeping the memory of the Eighth Queens alive? Besides the book, of course.
Yeah, so I am with my team. So I have a great digital history team that digitized Jack Piers's papers, Lieutenant Colonel H.J.C. Piers's papers, and they are available at www.jackpiers.org. That's PEIRS.org, and we created this web page in 2015 to as a centenary project. But since then, we've expanded it to include battlefield maps. We have also started telling the story of individual soldiers, common soldiers, a lot of them who fought in the 8th Queens. And we've been contacted, including this week, by ancestors of members of the 8th Queens who've donated their pictures and their biographies of their ancestors. So we have tried to preserve the memory of that unit through our website. And I think that in many ways, Piers would have liked that. I think that, serving in the 8th Queens was really the touchstone of his life. He believed strongly about esprit de corps and about helping former soldiers after the war. And so I think in a little bit we're trying to preserve the memory of all of these guys because I think it's an important story that should be told.
Yes, and I've linked out to the Jack website in the episode notes, so folks, you can click right on it through your phone and check it out. Oh my God, this is folks, it's an amazing book, The Battalion by Dr. Ian Isherwood. And I know it is post-Christmas, and I'm sorry we couldn't get you on here before the holidays, but hopefully we can get you a little bump in sales.
Thank you.
Your book definitely deserves to be read. So, Dr. Isherwood, thank you so very much for.
Thank you so much for reading it. Thank you again for having me on.
Absolutely.